I think we're coming to the end of a long day, and I can see the fatigue kind of reflected on many of the faces. I hope I can kind of keep you engaged for a little longer. This is not going to be, I promise you up front, this is not going to be anywhere near as interesting as what Ritvik said or what Aarti talked about. This is going to be dry stuff with numbers and like policy stuff, like completely uninteresting things, but that's all I know to talk about, so I'll talk about that. So what I want to do is kind of do a little bit of something like what Thomas did in the morning, except that I'm not going to take such a macro picture view in terms of looking at the whole economy, but I want to look at the entire energy sector and the energy sector's landscape and what are the kinds of issues that we as a country need to deal with if we have to deal with this transition in an effective manner. By effective, I mean in a, shall we say, smooth manner, fair, equitable, and so on and so forth, all the good adjectives we want. So the first thing, I think this is something I can really run through fast. A lot of people have talked about it. We are in the middle of a transition already. There's no debate about that anymore. I think Aarti touched upon this. The graph on the left shows new capacity addition from different sources, and you can see that renewables have been far outpacing coal. Though there's a word of caution here. This is easy to get carried away by. These numbers are not strictly comparable. The capacity you are adding for coal is not strictly comparable to the capacity you are adding with renewables. So one needs to keep that caution in mind, but still it's indicative of a big change. And that's reflected in the graph on the right, which is talking about the usage factors of coal-based plants falling rapidly over the last few years. So as I said, what I want to talk about is give you a very broad picture overview of the different kinds of issues that we as a country have to worry about. And out of this large set, I've chosen 2 or 3 issues that I'll dive a little deeper into and talk a little more about. So first, all the issues that I'm not going to go into detail about. The first is that as renewables, we have greater penetration of renewables in the electricity system. This is something that's known globally. This is not peculiar to India in any way. There are going to be technological challenges because renewable energy is intermittent. It's not going to be available all the time. How do you deal with that intermittency? That has policy implications, that has regulations implications, that has pricing implications. It has all those things. And one has to worry about formulating all those policies, for example, policies around forecasting and scheduling of renewable energy. You need to have regulations that are fair and that ensure that both the developers are kind of compensated and accounted for, as well as the purchasers of electricity do not get unduly affected if the sun, let's say, does not shine as expected on a given day. Then there's this other great debate around how does one develop the renewable energy sector in the country in terms of manufacturing, livelihoods, jobs. I think there has been some discussion already, but it's probably fair to say that India has already missed the bus in terms of marketing, in terms of manufacturing on the renewable energy sector side is concerned, as far as that is concerned, let's say solar panels or whatever. So clearly there is a lot of policy issues around that also. Then we have battery-based storage, which is going to be the, shall we say, the next solar revolution in the energy sector is going to be around storage, and that's really going to change the entire game pretty soon. And this again is going to come with its own whole set of policy related issues in terms of how are you going to promote storage in the first place? Are you going to, let's say, provide incentives to it? What kind of incentives to it? What kind of competitive markets are you planning to develop around it? What kind of regulations are you going to have? How does renewable storage integrate with the grid and with the renewables that you're going to have, and what kind of policies are you going to have around that? So all these things are going to play out in the next, let's say, 5 to 7 years in the country, and they're going to have profound implications on how the electricity sector in the country develops. Another interesting thing that is going to happen in the country in the next few years is that India, we do not have very, shall we say, deeply developed electricity markets. We have very kind of preliminary markets for electricity system in the country. We have largely state-owned distribution utilities that do bulk purchase of electricity from generators and distribute it to consumers. We don't have an active dynamic market for electricity except for a very small chunk of the electricity market in the country. Going forward, this is going to change. Not only is the traditional electricity that is being traded on, let's say, exchanges or bilaterally through trade deals going to increase, you're also going to have newer kinds of markets that are going to come into play. Things like capacity markets, ancillary services markets, real-time markets, and so on are going to increase in their presence. And the whole issue of how are you going to design these markets, who is going to govern these markets, what kind of regulations are going to govern these markets will again have profound implications for both the electricity system itself as well as for consumer welfare and citizens' welfare in general. The last of the points that I won't be going into in detail is, of course, around, so far I've only talked about the electricity sector, and obviously we know that electricity is not the entire energy system. In fact, if you consider the end use of energy, it's only about 20% of this is through electricity. Everything else is actually mostly for heating applications or for mobility applications. So how are you going to transform that? Yes, we have been talking about electrification of transport. That will help to some extent, but that is unlikely to be the whole story. You need other strings to your bow. You need other kinds of approaches. So I think in the morning we had to talk about hydrogen. That could be a potential solution, though perhaps further out in the future. Are we going to talk about biofuels? Biofuels come with their own controversies and their own concerns. Are we going to talk about other forms of energy? So all these issues need to be considered, and how we transform industry and transport in particular, the two sectors which have the most non-electrical applications, is going to be a big kind of determinant of how we transition away from fossil fuels in the longer term. The three sectors that I want to dive slightly deeper into are the big question, the big vexed question in India that seems to persist forever really, is the question of distribution companies. And there are newer dimensions to this challenge of electricity distribution companies that comes because of the energy transition that we are undergoing. Second, some of which again we have touched upon briefly, but I want to maybe kind of touch upon a few more issues related to the transitioning away from coal. While this is happening, but it is some of this transitioning may have painful aspects to it which need to be dealt with. The last thing that I will briefly go into, but not go into in too much detail, mainly because I am not exactly an expert on it, so is the issue of public finances and how that is going to be significantly affected by the energy sector transition. So firstly, the distribution company story, the discom story. As we all know, the distribution company is the consumer interface for electricity provision. It's especially for the smaller consumers, it is the kind of interfacing entity that people have. And in India, the structure is typically government owned, and it has been tightly regulated entities, mostly public sector owned, except in a few urban pockets where it's profitable for private sector to operate. It's otherwise public sector owned. And it's currently and historically a very, very problem-ridden sector. It has had serious governance challenges. It has had many inefficiencies in its planning and operations, as a result of which invariably consumers are the people who suffer. We have poor quality of supply and service, and the smaller the consumer or the more remote the consumer, the poorer the quality of supply and services. This sector has been mired in financial troubles. There have been repeated so-called bailouts to this sector. I think we've had about 4 different bailouts from the early 90s to about 3 or 4 years ago in the latest scheme called Uday. In spite of that, as of March 2015, these companies together had about 4 trillion of outstanding debt as well as accumulated losses. So essentially these are all money sitting on their balance sheets that somebody has to eventually bail them out of. And added to this kind of a, shall we say, not so healthy situation is the uncertain future that they face due to the upcoming energy transition. Why is that? Before going into that, of course, the reason we are worried about distribution companies is that they are a critical institution who are going to be important to supply electricity to small rural and agricultural consumers going forward. So there is no wishing them away. You have to have them. They are the only interface that small consumers are going to have. So how are you going to make sure that these institutions, which are already in deep trouble, are going to come out of this transition in a reasonable manner? So what are the challenges that they face? So what has happened in the last decade or so, which has kind of led to the current situation, is that there has been a lot of so-called capacity addition that has happened. So Indian generation capacity has shot up significantly, and a lot of it is fairly high cost. And all this has been contracted by the various distribution companies in the country. So these guys are sitting on purchase contracts of fairly high cost, which they are now struggling to supply to people. Another problem has been that typically the Indian energy sector, because it has traditionally been a sector of shortages. Only recently, as I think somebody pointed out in the morning, we are kind of reaching a place where shortages are kind of becoming a thing of the past. So because of the shortage mentality that we had, essentially all power procurement was so-called round-the-clock power procurement. You essentially purchase coal-based power, which would give you power round the clock because you anyway had shortages. Now we are reaching a situation where, because of increasing penetration of renewables, essentially time-based procurement of power is becoming increasingly important, and now these guys don't have the kind of capacity to do that or the financial muscle to do that. And as I said, they have sustained surplus baseload capacity because they bought so much baseload capacity in the recent past. And with recent changes in economics, what is happening is that your average cost of supplying power to any consumer in the country, roughly, these numbers don't go very strongly by these numbers, but roughly it's about 7 rupees per kilowatt hour today. While if I set up my own alternative supply source, essentially typically a rooftop solar or whatever, I can get it for about 5 rupees per kilowatt hour. So there's no reason any consumer would really want to go to the distribution company anymore, given a choice. And already you can see that if you look at all the distribution companies in the country, about 70% of the electricity they sell is to consumers, to non-agricultural consumers, is at costs of greater than 5 rupees per kilowatt hour, which means all those consumers will profit by going away from the distribution company. And this is already being seen. In many states, you can already see that a lot of the larger consumers of the distribution company, which are industries and commercial establishments, are moving away from the distribution company and setting up their own energy plants because it's cheaper for them. As a business entity, it makes perfect sense for them to do so. And what this does is two serious problems. One is that it creates a serious uncertainty for the distribution company in terms of how much power it should procure. It doesn't know what its demand is going to be. So even if I have a consumer within my geographical area, it doesn't mean that that consumer is going to buy electricity from me. So how much, if I need to procure power for the next year or next 10 years, how much electricity should I procure? There is uncertainty about that. The second problem is that the entire model of distribution companies, the business model of distribution companies in India has been the so-called cross-subsidy model, where the bigger, richer consumers pay a higher tariff in order to, so that you can charge the smaller consumers a smaller tariff. But if these bigger consumers start going away from your consumer base, they start setting up their own electricity plants, that whole model is going to collapse. You're not going to have the financial wherewithal to actually support this model. So essentially, you either need increasing subsidies or increasing bailouts to these people because they're not going to be able to finance themselves. And of course, it will result in poor quality of supply to the small consumers because these guys won't have enough power to supply them or will not be able to supply them at the prices at which small consumers can afford them. And you're going to have risks of stranded assets because these guys have purchased contracts for a lot of power which they are not able to supply to their consumers, and therefore they are not being able to pay to the electricity generators, and so you're going to end up with a problem of more stranded assets. So these are the multiple problems that could arise if you're not going to fix the distribution problem in the country. And the kind of larger reason why this is happening is because with the energy transition, the entire nature of the distribution company itself is undergoing a big change all over the world. In the older world, in the rather pre-transition world, essentially the distribution company was the sole interface to the consumer, all the consumers. So it not only provided the physical infrastructure of wires to carry the electricity, but it was also supplying the electricity on those wires. So it was a single bulk purchaser of electricity and supplier. It was a dominant grid user. It had a universal supply obligation to all consumers because that was the only entity that could supply electricity. And essentially the geographical demand was equal to the distribution company's demand. So if I as a distribution company had a certain geographical area under my command, the entire electricity demand in that area would be my duty to service. I was a monopoly supplier to them essentially. And it was a cross-subsidy based model. So all these things are going to change with the future scenario. So as I said, now people can set up their own plants and procure their own electricity. So the job of the discom will only be to supply, to provide the wires, the physical wires. It will be a supplier of last resort rather than a supplier of primary electricity. I as a company, if my plant fails for some reason, then I might draw electricity from the distribution company. So I'm suddenly changed into a backup or emergency supplier and so on and so forth. So the entire role of the distribution company is going to change as a result of these changes in the energy sector. And I think I've talked about most of these things. I won't spend time on it, but all these problems in terms of your baseload, your entire power procurement model has to change because there's demand uncertainty. It's not only baseload power that you have to procure. Your cost recovery has to change. It cannot be a cost plus method of operations wherein I'm guaranteed a certain amount of return, and for that I need to recover the money through my tariffs. The cross-subsidy model is not going to work. So all these things need to be relooked at, and unless we are able to do that and address the distribution company challenge, we are going to have a serious problem in terms of managing this transition effectively, and in particular protecting the smaller consumers from suffering too much because of the transition. The second lot that I want to talk about is the transition away from coal and what this would imply. Again, some of these points have already been talked about. I think many of these things Aarti has already touched upon, that the CEA has predicted that the coal share is going to come down. One interesting thing is that the Ministry of Environment and Forests way back in 2015 announced that there are going to be new norms for coal-based power plants, the emission norms that they have to meet, which they have not yet met. But the hope is that by 2022 at least they will hopefully meet that. But doing so will further hasten the end of coal, because it's only going to increase the cost of coal-based power. As it is, coal-based power has been getting costlier over the last 7 or 8 years. Implementing these norms will only make it costlier and therefore less competitive with alternatives, and that is going to lead to hasten the demise of coal in the country. In addition, of course, it's not that the coal thermal sector otherwise was functioning very effectively. There are a lot of inefficiencies within the coal thermal sector itself, in terms of delays in project completion, in terms of the companies renegotiating pricing contracts to actually increase the tariffs and so on and so forth, all of which is essentially going to make the coal sector further uncompetitive with respect to other sources. So the role of coal in the entire mix is going to reduce. Of course, this is not going to happen overnight. This will probably take a decade or longer for the transition to slowly take place. But the fact is that the role of coal in the country's energy mix is going to reduce over time. And what are the issues that is likely to throw up? One is, of course, the issue of livelihoods, which I think many people have talked about. There are no firm numbers available about what kind of livelihoods the coal sector supports, but directly, indirectly, through the entire coal value chain, a rough estimate is that it supports about 1 million livelihoods, which is not a small number, and which is something that one needs to worry about. Politically, it is something that is significant, and one needs to worry about how does one deal with transitioning these livelihoods to newer forms of livelihoods. Second, perhaps a slightly peculiar thing in the Indian context is that this kind of a love-hate relationships that public sector entities often have with the communities they're involved in. Often the coal companies, which are essentially public sector entities, also provide not just jobs but social and physical infrastructure in many of the local communities. They are the ones who are providing the water supply, they are the ones building roads in the local communities, and so on and so forth. So what happens to all that if the coal companies start moving out? So that's something that also needs to be worried about. The third issue is the second larger issue is in terms of the resources, whether it's financial or natural resources, and restoration of natural resources. So one basic problem that has been part of the Indian energy sector is that we have always been planning as though things have not changed, while things have completely changed over time. For example, as I showed in the first slide, the usage factors of coal-based power plants have fallen drastically and are only going to fall further. But even today, a justification for either opening a new power plant, coal-based power plant, or opening a new coal mine is that coal-based power plant is going to operate at 80%, when you know that it's not going to operate at more than 50%. So this is going to seriously risk locking in of creating more stranded assets and creating more NPAs as you go forward, and you're going to open mines that are probably going to be unviable. And of course, in the process, you're going to lock up resources such as land and water, because once you want to set up a power plant, it's not only going to be built on some land, it's also going to lock up some water resources. So you're going to lock up other resources. Similarly, we all know that coal mining and usage of coal mines has a lot of very significant impacts on land, whether it's in terms of the mines themselves or the ash dumps at coal-based power plants or whatever it is. The point is that again, as many people in this room know, that none of this ever gets restored when you either close down a power plant or when you close down a coal mine. When this starts happening at the large scale of the entire coal sector essentially withdrawing, how does one ensure that the land that's you had used up for coal mining essentially gets restored to some form where it becomes usable again by the local communities? How do you ensure that the ash dumps, I have no idea if those lands can ever be recovered, all those huge kind of acre swaths of land on which you have ash dumps today. And of course, in India, the coal bearing areas overlap significantly with forests. So how are you going to restore those forests, or are you going to be able to restore those forests as the coal withdraws? The last part of the coal related issues is in terms of the, shall we say, regional inequalities in the country. Coal reserves in the country are largely concentrated on the east of the country, which are also the relatively poorer parts of the country. So when coal starts withdrawing from these areas, not only is it going to have an employment impact in those areas, it's also going to have a lot of impact on the revenues of those states. Those states depend reasonably on coal for their revenue in terms of royalty, in terms of other taxes and other kinds of money that they collect due to the coal industry and coal-related ancillary industries that come up there. Similarly, there's the issue of financial institutions, because as we all know, the large part of the NPA problem in the country, or the stressed financial sector in the country, really comes from coal-based thermal power plants. And if these plants are not able to kind of repay their debts, and going forward the financial institutions get more reluctant to lend to the energy sector, then essentially you're going to have a negative cycle in terms of how these financial institutions are going to be able to deal with the energy transition, and whether they can support the energy transition, because after all the transition also needs financing support, and where that financing support can come from is an open question. And as somebody pointed out earlier, a lot of the NPAs, in fact all the NPAs or the stressed assets, are essentially, the debts are owned by the public sector banks. So essentially the contagion could go much beyond just the financial sector, because it's large amount of public resources that is locked in. It could actually go much beyond the public, beyond just the energy sector. The last point is about the Indian Railways, which is got this very symbiotic relationship with coal in India. Indian Railways again has this cross-subsidy model where it charges its freight consumers more so that it can charge passengers less. It also lives on a cross-subsidy model. And coal provides about half the entire freight revenue for Indian Railways today. So if the share of coal starts reducing, then how is Indian Railways going to become viable, or where is it going to get its money so that passenger fares can stay low? Or in India, increasing passenger rail fares is a very, very politically sensitive thing. How is that going to happen? So how is the railways going to be a viable agency at all? So that's about the coal story. And the last bit that I want to touch upon is the public finances thing. I just have one slide on this, and I think a concluding slide. So energy sector, as it happens, is a major contributor to the public finances of the country today. So there are lots of taxes, cesses, royalties, all kinds of sources for the country to get money out of the energy sector. So there's an excise duty on motor spirit, that's petrol, and HSD, which is diesel. There's a special additional excise duty on motor spirit. There's a cess on crude oil. There is GST compensation cess on coal. There's GST on all other forms of energy. So all these things together, this is a very rough estimate. It's not that we have a very, in fact, it's not even, I don't think it's even possible to calculate this. But roughly 10% of the tax revenue of the union government actually comes from energy. And when I say energy, most of it is of course coming from fossil-based energy. So as the country's public moves away from fossil-based energy sources, the government will have to seriously think about its entire public financing. How is it going to finance all its development projects, all its things, if 10% of its tax revenue is actually going to go away? What else is it going to be able to tax? And similarly, we have not done any analysis of the state government budgets, but royalties, duties, and all the other kinds of taxes would also form a fairly significant part of at least some state government budget, even if not all states in the country. So the entire taxation policy of the country we'll have to seriously think about it if we want to be able to deal with the transition in the energy sector. Otherwise, the country's public finances already, I think, as somebody was saying, the fiscal deficit challenge is already a big one. We are already talking of 5% fiscal deficit being a very serious thing to deal with. If you're going to actually lose more out of that because of this, then as a country we are going to be in trouble. So to conclude, the energy transition in India has multiple dimensions, and of course they come with multiple challenges and opportunities, and it is not just an energy sector issue. It kind of involves stakeholders well beyond the energy sector, whether it is a government, whether it's regulators, whether it's industry, whether it is of course citizens in society. And unless we are able to actually be much more nimble and much more proactive in terms of the policy, regulatory and institutional regime that we want, it's very clear that the current policy, institutional, regulatory regime is not sufficient to be able to deal with the complexities of this transition. So we need a new regime or a new framework of working on these things which will enable the smooth transition and be able to rapidly respond to changes, and while protecting the interests of the poor and the marginalized, because any transition is going to have winners and losers. How are you going to make sure that the losers, wherever they are the poor and marginalized, how do you protect their interests? That's going to be a big challenge. Thank you.